Welcome, you're listening to Cantus Firmus. I have as my guest today Dr. Stephen R. Haynes. Dr. Stephen Haynes is professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Rhodes College, where he teaches courses on a variety of subjects, including humanities, the Bible, the Holocaust, and addiction and recovery. He was educated at Vanderbilt University, Florida State University, Columbia Theological Seminary, and Emory University, where he received his PhD. Haynes is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and is theologian in residence at Idlewild Presbyterian Church in Memphis. He's married and has 3 children, Christiana, 27, Matthew, 24, and Braden, 13. Finally, he's the author or editor of 12 books, including Reluctant Witnesses, Jews and the Christian Imagination, Noah's Curse, The Biblical Justification of American Slavery, The Bonhoeffer Phenomenon, Portraits of a Protestant Saint, The Last Segregated Hour, The Memphis Kneel-ins and the Campaign for Southern Church Desegregation, and now The Battle for Bonhoeffer, Debating Discipleship in the Age of Trump. And it's this last book, which was just released, that I'm really interested in discussing today. So thank you very much for being here, Dr. Haynes.
Thank you for having me, Cody.
So to begin with, this isn't the first book you've written about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I might like to ask you, what drew you to him, and why do you think so many Christians, on the far right, far left, and everything in between, find him so intriguing?
Well, I started reading Bonhoeffer when I was in college, actually. I was part of a evangelical parachurch ministry for high school students, and as part of our leadership training, we were handed a copy of The Cost of Discipleship and asked to read it. We weren't given much help in interpreting the context or situation out of which this book had arisen, but it was really intriguing, and clearly there was somebody, the author was somebody who really understood the demands that Christian discipleship made on people. And so I found it really sort of riveting. And it was only later in graduate school that I got a sense for who Bonhoeffer really was, what his biography was like, and started reading some of his later stuff. And so I had this sort of background in Bonhoeffer's thought that stood with me. And when I got to Rhodes and I started teaching, my classes, kind of developed my repertoire of classes. One of them was a class on the Holocaust. And of course, I started to look at the German church struggle and how Christians had reacted to address the Nazi threat or the Nazi opportunity, depending on their perspective. And Bonhoeffer became even more intriguing because I saw that he was somebody who had seen very clearly early on the threat that Hitler represented, and despite his youth, had been committed to doing something about it. And so I became intrigued with Bonhoeffer yet again. And along the way, I realized that, as you've already mentioned, Bonhoeffer is somebody who is embraced by people on the left and the right and the middle, and people who are devout Christians, people who are agnostics. And I tried to sort of set out a typology for understanding Bonhoeffer's reception. And I thought it would maybe be a chapter in a longer book. It turned out to be a book all on its own called The Bonhoeffer Phenomenon. And I don't think there's anybody whose reception is quite as broad, quite as interesting as Bonhoeffer's. And so that has really intrigued me, and I think it led ultimately to the battle for Bonhoeffer.
Oh, that's really interesting. So he's an interesting guy to read because he's not exactly like a conservative fundamentalist, but he does say a lot of things that more conservative Christians are going to appreciate.
Right.
And I think in particular his struggle against Nazism. We sort of have a tendency to look at whoever we think are the dangerous people on the other side of the political spectrum from us as these sort of Nazis in a way, types. And that's what I think is kind of fascinating about Bonhoeffer, because he has been co-opted by the political and religious right and left and kind of weaponized. And so
yes,
I mean, a little bit of biographical background. He's this German church theologian who is very much against what the Nazis are doing, both in their treatment of the Jews, but also in their trying to take control of the German church. And really, I think people are not necessarily aware of some of the, not just the issues like in orthopraxy, as far as like how the Nazis treated, Jewish people and minorities, but the ways that they challenged the biblical orthodoxy, the way that they wanted to handle scripture, and had this sort of Marcionite tendency to cut out Jewish things,
Right.
and all these other things. I mean, they really kind of took like this sort of German liberal view of Jesus and then racialized it.
Mhm.
And so it seemed that a lot of Bonhoeffer's contemporaries were fine to want to go after the Nazis for what they were doing to, to Jesus and Orthodoxy, but they didn't really want to go after some of these issues about how, human beings made in the image of God were being treated.
Yeah.
And before we maybe get into that a little bit more, I do want to know how you see Bonhoeffer, like as far as who was he really when it comes to these issues of political and religious right and left? Does he fit neatly into one of these categories?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it would be really useful if I could tell you exactly who Bonhoeffer was, and then everybody who appreciated Bonhoeffer could sort of take their lead from that. But he's a complicated figure, and one reason he's complicated is he doesn't write. I mean, he writes in situations of extremity where there's a lot of pressure, like the Cost of Discipleship is a good example. So he writes this book presumably ostensibly about discipleship, but he's also writing about what it means to be a Christian in an authoritarian state. But he can't say a great deal about that. A lot of his letters from prison are very provocative. They've been a great boon to sort of radical theologians and trying to rethink Christianity after World War II. But by nature, they're letters and they're not developed treatises, and so we have it's difficult to really understand, what he meant, what he would have said later, and so forth. So a lot of his writings are sort of elliptical in this way. I think what you said earlier about Bonhoeffer being sort of attractive to evangelicals is very true. He writes in a way that has a lot of sort of pious language, and a lot of it's very clear that his commitment to Christ is fundamental, and these are things that one doesn't always find in continental theology. So he's definitely a church theologian. He's definitely someone who is committed to sort of understanding what the meaning of Christ is for his time. And when you combine that with his what people refer to as his martyrdom, his commitment to his opposition to Nazism despite the consequences, I think you fuse those things together, it becomes very compelling. And I think people who are, I've met many people who don't know much about Bonhoeffer and frankly aren't going to go off and, read Sanctorum Communio or his dissertation on the church or something, but are so impressed by his level of commitment that he was willing to die for his beliefs. That's all they really need to know. And so because of that, I think Bonhoeffer tends to be sort of shaped into people's own images, right? We kind of see what we want to see, what we need to see, which is one thing I'm talking about in the Battle for Bonhoeffer, the way that Bonhoeffer becomes very useful for people who are in a particular political argument, particular political moment, who need to, who want to sort of add Bonhoeffer's moral gravitas to their side of the story. And so they bring him in one way or another.
Sure. I'm thinking specifically when you talk about him not always writing super explicitly or clearly, this phrase "religionless Christianity" that shows up in the letters and papers from prison that I'd heard was kind of a central issue here, and the kind of the battle for Bonhoeffer, as you say. When I read that in the letters and papers from prison, I said, okay, this is the section. I'm going to figure this out, and we're going to see what he really says here. And then I read it, and I thought, I really don't know what he's saying here. and it is. There are times, obviously, and I like the phrase that you used, commitment to Christ, and it was kind of the same sort of phrase I was thinking about, but I think I added the word radical to it in my head. That what I think maybe impresses so many evangelicals is his radical commitment to Christ that you don't often see on, a lot of liberal theologians, I think, can often be sort of, dry and theoretical, but Bonhoeffer is very warm to the person of Christ.
Yeah.
but also willing to challenge certain, issues that he was seeing in the church. He, was a bit of a rabble rouser in that sense. Well, one issue I think that comes up a lot in these controversies over Bonhoeffer is his alleged pacifism.
Yeah.
And it seemed like most people agreed that he was a pacifist, generally speaking, in previous decades, apart from that detail that he was maybe implicated in a plot to assassinate Hitler.
There is that.
What's that?
There is that.
Yeah, there's that. And there's a lot of debate about how does that fit into this whole thing, and maybe a statement he makes, I think, on his book on ethics about sometimes having two contradictory values in front of you that you have to choose one or the other. The suggested idea is that he saw killing Hitler as an evil, but he also saw what Hitler could do as such a great evil that to not try to kill him was also an evil in a way, and that he would just sort of have to choose one and then pray for forgiveness. Which is, I mean, obviously that's a really tough spot to be in. It's hard, even if you're a pretty strong pacifist, it's hard to fault him too much for that.
Well, what I would add to that is to say that it was an evil for him, given what he knew, given for the position he was in, the sort of connections he had not to do something. I don't think he would extend that to say that everybody was required to do what he did. I think he realized this was a very personal situation that he was in, given his connectedness.
Well, but I think the underlying question here is whether he was actually a pacifist at all, and I think obviously that's been challenged by the religious right and Eric Metaxas's 2009 biography, which seemed to have got you really thinking about this issue about how Bonhoeffer's pulled in all these directions by later thinkers. So I do think that's a worthy thing to think about, is how Bonhoeffer thought about violence. As you read him, I mean, do you think that Metaxas is right, that he wasn't really a pacifist at all, or do you see that there's this more nuanced approach?
Well, I think there's a nuanced approach to this, and I think it's one that actually Bonhoeffer scholars had sort of set out, years before Metaxas came along, but he wasn't really familiar with this scholarship, and so it was difficult for him to really follow the thread of thinking. But Clifford Green talks about Bonhoeffer as having a peace ethic. And I think this is maybe a better, more fruitful way to think about Bonhoeffer's approach to violence than as pacifism or non-pacifism. I mean, Bonhoeffer, throughout his career, was focused, well, at least after New York in 1931, was focused on peace. And the demands of peace change depending on one's situation. They might be one sort of demand in the 30s and facing things like rearmament and approach to war is something very different when you're thinking about the opportunity to oppose Hitler. But I think it wasn't so much a principled rejection of violence, but a commitment to peace and a commitment that had different demands. The other scholar who talked about this way back in the 70s in a really interesting way was Larry Rasmussen. In his dissertation, he really makes it clear that Bonhoeffer's pacifism, let's say, leading up to World War II, is very specific. He says, I can't take up arms in this conflict at this time, given this leader. And I think that's convincing, that it was Bonhoeffer's pacifism was always informed by the needs, the demands of the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. Whereas I think I come from a more strongly Christian pacifist background. I think if nothing else, when you read what Jesus says, for example, on the Sermon on the Mount, if nothing else, you ought to be moving toward that peace ethic, even if you don't ultimately find that even if you don't necessarily hold to it radically or in every scenario. So one thing I thought about recently, there was that statement on social justice that this was kind of fairly controversial from a lot of evangelical leaders, although a lot of evangelical leaders also specifically spoke against it. But in light of like these recent debates on whether social justice distracts from the gospel, I wonder if you think there are any lessons we can learn about or from Bonhoeffer and how he tried to make the so-called Jewish question a central issue for the confessing church at the time. and the pushback he received from all of his colleagues who just wanted to challenge this sort of the Nazis attempting to redefine traditional Orthodox beliefs?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think Bonhoeffer's a great guide in this regard, because in the sort of one of his shining moments was in April 1933 when he was asked to give a paper at a meeting of a group of pastors on the Jewish question. And this document, this paper is called "The Church and the Jewish Question," and it says a lot of interesting things in there. But one of the things that's very clear is his line that the church has an unconditional obligation to the victims of state action, whether or not they belong to the Christian community. And I don't know if that's the point where people got up and walked out, but at some point they did. And it was very clear for him, I don't know that it would have used this language, very clear that the so-called, social justice and the demands of the hour with regard to social justice were inseparable from the gospel as he understood it. And the whole question, well, there was the theological question about what does the church owe the state? But that was sort of suspended given the needs of real people at the moment that were being, whether or not they were Christians or Jews or Jewish Christians, they were being threatened and they needed to be defended. And this was a departure from Lutheran orthodoxy and in the understanding of church and state. And I think maybe that's what people heard that they had a hard time accepting. Bonhoeffer is the only one, he's the only German theologian that I know of who's making that sort of categorical statement about the church's obligation to help victims of state action, at that moment in time. So I think he's a great example of where, this discussion is at certain moments becomes irrelevant. You do what Jesus would do. You do what Christians feel are called to do. You support people who are in need. You address injustice. You bind up the wounds and so forth.
And that would be regardless of the government's position on the issue, and however you interpret Romans 13.
It's interesting he doesn't mention Romans 13, and I think probably in the back of people's minds who are listening, they're thinking, well, what about Romans 13? But I think it's significant that he doesn't address it. It's also significant in the Barmen Declaration that they don't cite Romans 13. They cite a verse from 1 Peter, which says something like, fear God, honor the emperor, or something like that. In other words, put God first. And I think for Christians who understood what was at stake with Nazism, Romans 13 didn't apply. They sort of instinctively knew that. And of course, for pro-Nazis, they thought Romans 13 had to be respected. But I think they had obvious reasons for taking that view.
Yeah. Well, and to be clear for those who have some of this background, the Barmen Declaration, that was the statement of the confessing church as to their principles in light of the Nazi attempt to co-opt the church. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And it didn't say a lot about the Jews. It didn't say anything about the Jews. It was timid in that regard, but it was very significant that they did not take a traditional view of the church's obligation to sort of honor the state at all costs based on the assumption that God had established it. I mean, this was really they were taking a stand against the state, but also against Nazified Christians who wanted to align themselves with Nazism.
Yeah,
big issue.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's fascinating to look at all of these issues that we divide over in the church. Issues that we think are of grave significance. So, Catholics and Protestants will talk about how we treat the body of Christ in the Eucharist and the level of respect that we should afford it. But here in this statement, the Barmen Declaration, you had this sort of debate, and ultimately there were people who said, well, those kinds of questions are more important maybe than how we treat the bodies of men and women and children made in the image of Christ, and we have to just sort of keep that as a secondary issue. Obviously, it seems that Bonhoeffer disagreed with that. That whole issue about the way they debated how to involve the Jewish question I mean, ultimately, would you say they were wrong and Bonhoeffer was right about that? And where does that, what kind of example does that give us now? When obviously, I don't want to make a direct comparison between Hitler and Trump or something like that, but where we are just in a contemporary situation in general in the West, how
Well,
should we be approaching some of these issues?
here's the comparison I would make to our current situation. It's not so much between Hitler and Trump; it's between German Christians, that is the Deutsche Christen, the Christians who really wanted to endorse Nazism and sort of jump on the Nazi bandwagon, and Christians today who are sort of all in on Trump. And I think the question is, in both cases, what are people willing to put up with to get something they want? So in the case of German Christians, what they wanted was a sort of revival of Christianity, which had sort of lost its cultural significance to some extent in the Weimar era, a sort of bringing back of traditional values, German pride and so forth. That's what they wanted. What they were willing to give up was, state action on the Jewish question, which may have bothered them, but they didn't see it as really that important. I think today the question is, for Christians who support Trump, what are they willing to put up with in order to get a Supreme Court that will strike down Roe v. Wade? It's really, I think, a pretty simple analogy, and I'm not saying that there's a direct, obvious answer to that question, but it is. If you answer that question with the Nazi situation in mind, it's very it's very sobering, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and what's interesting to me is that the church is essentially compromised by not just these sort of racialized politics in the Nazi era, but also a politicized, patriotic, nationalistic kind of hybrid. And one thing that comes to mind is some of the songs and hymns that were modified in the Third Reich. The one that comes to mind immediately is the Silent Night, where it was tweaked to be about Hitler standing on guard and watching over the German people while they slept.
Some of that seems really ridiculous looking back, but I think the underlying point is a good one, which is that there was a real sort of layer of patriotism among Christians. And in this midst of this patriotic movement, this nationalist movement, they didn't want to be out of step. They didn't really speak out against the German government because they knew they wouldn't get anybody to sign the document. People may have been against Nazifying the church, but they didn't want to be perceived as being un-German or anti-Hitler. And that was an important distinction.
Are there clear examples for us there about where maybe we should draw some of those lines between maybe a healthy patriotism and a radical, kind of Christ-denying nationalism?
Yeah, well, I don't know that the lines are clear. I mean, they're never clear in situations like this, right? But I think the questions maybe are clear, right? So we need to be asking, if particularly if we're interested in learning from this history, we need to be asking, in what sense are we reluctant to criticize someone or something or some policy because we don't want to be considered unpatriotic or sort of favoring the enemy or something like that. I think you read these, especially there's a book by Vicky Barnett called "For the Soul of the People." It's a study of the confessing church, and it was really eye-opening for me because you realize how timid most of the people in the confessing church were, and how little they really wanted to step out and be perceived as being against the government, or even sort of taking a wait and see attitude. Right? They wanted to be considered part of this movement, and they didn't want to have their patriotism questioned. And as a result, they sort of allowed Hitler a chance to amass power. And when they finally came around and realized, whoa, we should have done something, it was really too late.
In our present situation, oftentimes a criticism of policies or nationalistic or racialistic almost from people who would disagree with that criticism gets wrapped up in reverence for the troops. And I wonder how much. I mean, I wonder how much of that was the case in Nazi Germany, or how much of it was just sort of a straightforward. Well, this is the fatherland, and that's it. Or how does it sort of did that get wrapped up at all in your understanding with a reverence for these sainted men in the military?
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought of that before, but I think there are some analogies. I mean, you had in the wake of World War I, you had a lot of people who were wounded. You had a lot of veterans with very scarring memories. I think they were a constant reminder of people who had really sacrificed a lot. And I think it was difficult for people to express what might be considered think about pacifism, for instance, right? Bonhoeffer's decision not to join the army. It's hard for us to imagine what that would have been like. Conscientious objection in our culture is countercultural enough. Imagine doing that in Germany. People were executed for that stance. So I think the idea that that one would not support the country, would not agree to serve, would question military decisions, was really a zone where nobody wanted to find themselves.
Well, yeah, and it seems that in World War I, at the very least, in the aftermath, this faith in the German people and in the German military led them to not really accept the loss.
Yeah.
So that was really, Hitler sort of stepped in with, and he wasn't the first one, but he stepped in with this explanation of, well, this was the stab in the back. We didn't lose the war. The Jews forced, somehow by their machinations,
Right.
They did something to force us to lose the war.
Right.
And yeah, so I think about that a fair bit. This how it becomes so difficult for so many folks to separate questioning policies, including even like military policies, because obviously there's a lot of young German men in the military in World War I and II who are trying to protect their country and may have the best intentions at heart, but at the end of the day they're still invading Czechoslovakia, and it becomes very difficult sometimes to separate these things, particularly when you have a state that functions in some sense as a religion in a way, and military becomes sort of sainted figures, I think.
That's right.
Okay, wow. Okay, so maybe just kind of a broader question. What do you see are the dangers of the church becoming too intertwined with state power? What were they in Hitler's Germany, and what would they be today?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this question since I saw it in your email. I think, there are two different questions. One is, should the state be political? I mean, should the church be political? Should it have political interests? Should it be concerned with social justice? All of which I think is yes. But state power is a little different, right? Because that sort of puts us in the situation we were talking about earlier, where Christians want the benefits and the perks of state power. And so, Trump has this collection of evangelical advisors, and they're visiting Trump Tower and the White House. And this is very alluring, that siren song of state power. And I think those two things can get confused very easily. So that I think, Christians need to be very concerned with politics. I think they need to be very concerned with justice. I think they need to be very wary of being co-opted. I don't know if you've read the book yet, but in the last chapter, I talk about some of my own experiences and how they've kind of shaped me. And I was the main experience that's important in this regard is that I was a kid growing up in church, Key Biscayne, Florida, where Richard Nixon had a house, and so he would visit our church occasionally. Our pastor got very close to him, was invited to the White House. Would preach, was a spiritual advisor to the president, and so forth. And then when Watergate happened, everybody was shocked because we had come to sort of think of this man as one of us, as an evangelical Christian. And then when our pastor, John Huffman, sort of confronted him and said, "Did you know anything about Watergate?" He said no. And then when it came out that he did, Huffman publicly repudiated him in sort of Time magazine. And that's always been, it's sort of had a twofold effect on me. One is being really suspicious of politicians who court evangelical support. but also the sort of courage that was demonstrated by our pastor, just drawing the line and saying, look, regardless of our friendship and the fact that you sort of align with my own political views, I'm not going to let you get away with calling yourself a Christian, given the way you've acted. And I think this, the whole Trump revolution has been traumatic for me in some ways, differently than it's been traumatic for other people, just by bringing up that old wound of feeling manipulated and used by somebody who needed and wanted evangelical support, but really had no interest in, didn't have the same values that we did, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, he wasn't the only one who I think became very disaffected by that closeness with Nixon that ended up being sort of a betrayal. I mean, famously, Billy Graham really stepped away from political involvement after that. And it seems, from my perspective anyway, that his son Franklin hasn't learned that same lesson from Trump yet.
Not yet.
Yeah. Oh, and I did want to say, you said if I had a chance to read the book yet, I was wanting to get a hold of it before this interview, and I think at the time that I looked at it, it was out of stock. It seems like it's selling really well.
It did go out of stock really quickly. I don't know if, but it's back in stock, so hopefully you'll get one soon.
I absolutely want to get it. And do you know if there's going to be a Kindle version available?
There should be a Kindle version. There's also an Audible version, which I don't know if it's out yet, but it's been recorded, so I don't know what the wait time for that will be. So, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, wonderful. Man, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and I've been excited about this book since I saw it. I mean, I think we need a book like this right now, because I think Bonhoeffer does provide, in a very interesting, a very helpful test case for how to relate to power, and he's somewhat of a repudiation also of what maybe could be called a more faithless approach of wanting to get state power on your side and not actually trusting God to do the right thing, regardless of whether you have the state on your side.
Yeah, it's an interesting, the whole Constantinian model is talked about a lot. And I think people like Stanley Hauerwas and others, reminded us a couple of decades ago that the post-Constantinian era is a good thing. We don't have the same temptations of being co-opted by the state. And I think this is kind of a resurgence of that Constantinian model of, let's Christianize the state or pretend like it's Christian, and let's, use it to further our own goals. And I think it's a dangerous sort of atavism.
Thank you so much for being here, being on the podcast. I wish you a lot of good fortune with your book. It seems like it's already doing very well, and I'm glad to see that. I hope it makes a dent in sort of, well, I don't want to be too mean about Eric Metaxas, but I hope it makes a dent in at the very least some of maybe some of the negative things that came about with his biography. Although, it was I think really introduced a lot of people to Bonhoeffer, and so I don't want to say it was a completely negative influence on this whole issue, but
it's really a mixed blessing. I say this in the book because it sort of made Bonhoeffer a household name in some ways, but it also led to some misconceptions that I think the rest of us have been fighting. So,
sure, yeah. My first, when I heard about the book and some people were reading it, I thought, hey, that's great. Maybe I should get a hold of this book. And then I saw him on Glenn Beck, and I thought, maybe there's something else going on here.
I know. Yeah, I had the same reaction.
Yeah.
Where I first saw him was on the Glenn Beck show.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Haynes.
Thanks, buddy.